Hi everybody. We're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, quarantine, lockdown, and as usual on the internet there's a lot of misinformation out there about anything, but in this case about the coronavirus, maybe things you can do to treat it, protect yourself and whatnot. Misinformation can be really dangerous, not just stupid, but dangerous, and in this case something particularly dangerous has been the notion that certain pharmaceutical drugs meant to kill different types of living things may have some effect against the coronavirus. So my goal today is to give you a little bit of microbiology understanding and some pharmacology to go with it so that you'll understand why that is nonsense and people are apparently getting hurt trying to follow this advice. If it weren't for the fact that the advice was coming from very high up in our administration, albeit the very top, in fact, maybe it wouldn't be so widespread, but this ignorance is dangerous in this case, so I'm going to try to break it down for some of you in a way you might understand. We have a whiteboard and a marker. I'm going to use these for visual aids. Okay, so we'll start with the idea of a human cell. Okay, it's not that easy to show, but a human cell is kind of a plastic bag, basically. We have a nucleus, which is where all of our genetic material is housed, primarily our DNA. And then we also have a very complex cell structure. We don't have a cell wall, but we have just this membrane around it. And then there are all these little things called vesicles that do various disposal and processing jobs. Endoplasmic reticulum that generate proteins for us and also detoxify chemicals and things of that nature. We have a lot of these little tiny proteinaceous structures that have RNA and protein in them called ribosomes that help transfer or translate the messages from our DNA into proteins eventually, so the machinery that does that sort of thing. And human cells, this is one of them. We have maybe 1 trillion in our body, okay? If you contrast that with a bacterium, size comparison, bacteria might be this big, they're much smaller. But to scale it up so you can see a bacteria is plural, so bacterium, most of them have a cell wall also, so this additional structure around the outside that we don't have. They'll have a flagella, which they can use to swim, maybe more than one of them. Might have some other little structures on the surface. They don't have a nucleus. Okay, that's a big key difference. No nucleus. Their genetic material, also DNA, is just kind of spread out inside them. They don't have so many little vesicles and some of these other complicated structures to synthesize things like we do, not to the same degree, but they have ribosomes because they also have to make proteins. They also have to divide themselves, they have to replicate their genetic material, they have to perform detoxification and synthesis functions, process nutrients. They have some complexity as well, not to the level we do. And they have to generate their own energy within this cytoplasm, just the liquid inside. Whereas we have things called mitochondria in our cell, which are a lot like bacteria. The mitochondria in our cell generate all of our energy. They take glucose and they turn it into energy for us to use for everything that our cell does. That relies on these structures inside our cell that are called mitochondria that are basically bacteria. They're exactly like bacteria. That's important when you talk about drugs that kill bacteria. A lot of them also have some negative effect on our mitochondria. So a lot of antibiotics can just cause fatigue, for example, because they're suppressing your cellular energy production in a very general way. One of the most important things I want to point out for this particular talk is the fact that bacteria also have ribosomes, those little protein and RNA structures that turn your genetic code into specific proteins. We have ribosomes, they have ribosomes, but they're different. That's a pretty stark difference genetically and evolutionarily between human cells or animal cells, period, and the ones that are in bacteria. Now, the other thing that's relevant to this particular conversation is protozoa, parasites like malaria, right? Because one of the drugs that's being suggested might have some effect against coronavirus is a malaria drug. So they kill protozoa. Protozoa are bigger than bacteria in general, smaller than human cells, but maybe not so much, depends on the human cell. But they're also fairly complex cell types. They have a nucleus, so let's just make them a little bit different shape. They don't really have a cell wall. They're more like us than like the bacteria. They have a nucleus also where their genetic material is. They have some other structures inside, ribosomes and other things to do a lot of the stuff that we do. Biggest difference between them, one is they have motility, so they'll have flagella or cilia around them too. They have to be able to swim around because they're single-celled organisms. We have 1 trillion of these that make up me, but a protozoan is by itself. Like each one is an individual. They're single-celled organisms, but they're eukaryotic cells. They have a nucleus and a higher level of complexity like we do. So evolutionarily, they're somewhere in between bacteria and animal cells in here. But they're more complex. They have a lot of the same kind of stuff, right? One of the things that you look for pharmacologically to kill something, if you want to, take an antibiotic, an antiviral, an antiparasitic, whatever, if you're looking for a drug that's going to kill a germ, but you don't want it to kill yourself, right? You don't want it to kill a human cell. That would be bad, usually. But you want it to kill one of these. So you look for targets that are unique, okay? You look for something in the bacterium that isn't present in us and use that as a target for the pharmaceutical intervention. So the drug azithromycin, which is one of the drugs that's being touted as maybe having some effect against coronavirus, what it does is it specifically impairs the ribosome activity in the bacterium. Because the ribosomes, like I said before, are different from our ribosomes. So they made drugs called macrolides in this particular class of antibiotic. It's a macrolide antibiotic. It interferes with ribosomal activity in bacteria, but not in animal cells, human cells. So it will interfere with the bacterium ability to replicate itself, to survive, to process nutrients, everything that it needs proteins for. It'll tend to shut it down. So they're effective that way, and they have minimal side effects against human cells. I mean, the fact that it's a chemical, it's a drug itself, has side effects. It has to be detoxified, it has to go through the liver, it can be processed. Drugs in that class tend to cause a lot of nausea. Occasionally they can cause some liver toxicity. So can just about anything else that we use because it's a foreign chemical substance and the liver has to deal with it. But based on the specific antimicrobial mechanism, it doesn't really affect the human cell like that. So it's a pretty safe, non-toxic sort of drug to use. The antiparasitic drug that's being touted as effective against the coronavirus that works on protozoa like malaria, it's not so different. I mean, these cells aren't so different between our cells and the protozoan cells. A lot of the same machinery. Hydroxychloroquine, the drug that they're suggesting might have some effect on the virus, has very general sort of physiologic effects on a cellular level. It interferes with membrane function and it interferes with vesicle function. So some general kind of changes in the cell chemically take place. It makes the pH change, which throws off every chemical reaction in the cell. It interferes with a lot of processing functions based on vesicular inhibition. And so it has a lot of toxicity for human cells, a lot. If you look up the serious adverse side effects list for hydroxychloroquine, it can suppress bone marrow production of your white blood cells and red blood cells and things because those are highly complex and highly metabolic functions. It can alter the pH of your cell. It can cause retinal damage that could even lead to blindness if you don't stop the drug in time. It can cause sudden liver failure. So it's not a safe drug to just take for no reason. If you have malaria, okay, sure, it's the lesser evil to not die of malaria. If you have some really severe autoimmune syndrome, it has suppressive function in that regard. But because of those general physiological suppressive activities of the drug, it reduces some of the inflammatory chemical production, it reduces some of the antibody production, some of those just high complexity things, but it's a double-edged sword. It's not as safe as, say, the azithromycin might be. The biggest problem here is that viruses have nothing in common with these things, okay? A virus is not even a cellular organism. It's not even an organism. When you break down the kingdoms of living things, so biology, taxonomy, we have animals, okay? We're animals. You have Monera, which is bacteria. You have Protista, protozoans, these complex single-celled organisms. And then you have plants, which aren't represented here, but they're a lot like human cells, but with a cell wall. And you have fungi, mushrooms, yeast, mold, that stuff. So that's it, the 5 kingdoms. It's debatable whether viruses are even alive. That's an ongoing kind of debate in biology. One of the reasons you can argue that they're not alive is because they need another cell to survive. A virus is here represented like size-wise, it's like just not even a dot. All a virus is a little bit of genetic material, either DNA or RNA. And in the case of the coronavirus and a lot of viruses that cause transient infections in human beings, it's an RNA virus. Some DNA-based viruses include all the herpes viruses, like herpes simplex 1 and 2, Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, varicella, what causes chickenpox. Those DNA-based viruses, they can incorporate themselves into our nuclear DNA and stay forever, right? The gift that keeps on giving. But RNA viruses, most of them come and go. And they can't necessarily take up latent status in our genome. So these come and go. It's just RNA with a protein shell around it called a capsid. And then some viruses also have like an envelope around them, right? Which is a bit of membrane. But viruses can't live on their own. They don't have any of these replicating machinery things that they need to make more of themselves. They don't have ribosomes at all because they're not cellular. So how is a drug like azithromycin that attacks ribosomes specifically, and specifically bacterial ribosomes, the 50S protein subunit of the bacterial ribosome, how is that going to have an effect on the virus? It's not, especially when this virus happens to be infecting a human cell, which doesn't have the ribosomes that azithromycin attaches to. Total nonsense, okay? The other thing is, it's not cellular. So the drug like hydroxychloroquine that interferes with all these complex cellular functions isn't going to affect the virus directly either. Could hydroxychloroquine modulate the way a human cell behaves when it's infected with the virus? Maybe, but probably not in a good way. Like we said before, well, I said, no one talking, hydroxychloroquine suppresses immunological function in a fairly general way. And because it's used for autoimmune diseases, it reduces that immune response. It reduces that inflammatory response to some extent. It can allow certain immune phenomena to get worse, to go unchecked, like psoriasis can flare, for example. Some other immunological things can flare. So to think that it's going to have a beneficial effect on your ability to fight off something when it is more inherently immune suppressive is dangerously ignorant, okay? Now, when a virus replicates itself, it has to use the cell that it's infecting. Every complex cellular organism on the planet has viruses that infect it, even bacteria. Bacteria have their own viruses. They're called bacteriophages, and they're very specific. Each type of bacteria has a particular bacteriophage. They'll infect it and kill it. And they're being used as antimicrobial interventions now when antibiotics fail. If you ask me, bacteriophage therapy should be first line, not second line, because bacteriophages are specific to the bacteria that you're trying to kill in your body, and they have no effect on you at all, because they're completely targeted specific, right? But when this virus, the coronavirus, gets in a human cell, what it does is it borrows our machinery, okay? It borrows our ribosomes and borrows our cytoplasm and borrows all the machinery inside and our genetic translational machinery to make more of itself. And then it replicates a ton inside your cell and then bursts out. Some of them kill the cell on their way out, and other viruses don't actually kill the infected cell. They just kind of emerge, and they take this cell membrane from our cell membrane. They bud off of here as they leave. So it's kind of this interesting thing. They're not really alive. They're just parasitic sort of organisms in a very pure sense. So to find a drug that specifically targets this thing is very difficult because it inherently uses our cellular metabolic machinery, our cellular processes to propagate itself. So it's not that easy to find an antiviral drug that targets the virus without doing something to us in the process. Certain kinds of viruses, like herpes viruses, they genetically code for a very key enzyme that's unique to them. And so drugs have been made that target the thymidine kinase enzyme specific to herpes viruses, like acyclovir, valacyclovir. that class of drug, right? And those are effective, but only for herpes viruses. Would have no effect on a coronavirus because it doesn't have that herpetic thymidine kinase. Get it? Okay. I know this is getting more complex, but this is the issue, is that it's complex. We have an antiviral against influenza that is kind of moderately effective. It's not even all that effective, so it doesn't get used all that much. And it's not going to have any effect on this virus either, because it's specific to influenza-based, enzymes and functions. We have a whole bunch of drugs for HIV. HIV is a different example too, because HIV is a retrovirus. And without getting into the weeds on that, retroviruses have to go through a very complicated and specific function to replicate themselves that other viruses don't have to do. And it involves enzymes that we don't possess in our cells. So the virus itself codes for some enzymes and proteins that we don't have. So the pharmaceutical companies can target those things and make drugs that interfere with retroviral replication that don't particularly interfere with human cells. There's a lot of toxicity with those drugs still. Like I said, they're chemicals. You put chemicals in the human body and you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. You get the good and the bad. An example would be Tylenol, right? So many people in this country every year die of Tylenol overdose. But Tylenol can reduce your fever and your pain and things like that, but it can also cause fulminant liver toxicity and failure. Oops, right? So you can't just throw drugs at problems and hope they're going to work. You can't take an antibiotic made to kill bacteria and pray that it's going to affect a virus. That's ridiculous. You can't take an anti-protozoan drug that also has complex immune suppressive effects on our human cells and hope that it's going to have any effect on a virus, okay? Or what the virus does to you. It's just dangerously stupid, all right? So wash your hands, stay at home. The best hope you have is just not getting this virus, right? That's the social isolation thing. And things that'll help improve your own immune function. Vitamin D has a very strong effect on immune resistance to infection and also an immune modulatory effect on hypersensitivity responses. And without getting too far into that subject, part of the reason you see very differential response to a virus like this is the host. It's not the virus that's different in different people, giving some people very minor symptoms and some people fatal symptoms. It's how that person responds. It's how your immune system responds to that virus. And one of the things vitamin D does in particular is it modulates hypersensitivity reactions, which is why vitamin D is helpful for autoimmune and allergic response conditions, not just infectious conditions. So that's probably more important to take than vitamin C or any of these other things that people might talk about out there. And the idea of a vaccine, they're throwing that around out there in the government and whatnot, but coronaviruses are not a new type of virus. There are over 200 described strains of coronavirus. It causes the common cold. And so the common cold's been around a long time. It's caused a lot of loss of work, days missed of school, misery for people. And if there was a cure for the common cold, people would have probably brought that out a long time ago, right? There's $1 billion to be made there by some pharmaceutical company. It's not that easy. You see with the COVID-19 thing that the virus can mutate very spontaneously, very rapidly, very drastically, which is why we have this COVID-19 strain, which is different than the ones we've seen before. SARS, the SARS epidemic, or not even epidemic, it was kind of a smaller thing, but the SARS issue 17, 18 years ago was also a coronavirus. But it's not the same coronavirus that this one is. And next year we might have a different coronavirus, right? And the differences are the proteins on the outside. And so when you make a vaccine, you have to find a way to get your immune system to make effective antibodies and immune response mechanisms against very specific target proteins on the outside of that viron. And if it changes all the time, good luck targeting it. This is what we run into with influenza. They make a new flu vaccine every year based on guessing what they think the outer proteins are going to look like on the influenza virus next year. And as they keep mentioning, even though we've had flu vaccines for decades, we still experience dozens of thousands, 25,000 to 65,000 people dying in this country every year from influenza, despite our best efforts. So if you think that in a year they're going to make an effective vaccine against a particular coronavirus, I would say the odds are pretty slim. Are they going to make an effective antiviral? I already talked about how hard it is to make an antiviral drug that works. The odds of that are pretty slim too. Like I said, coronavirus causes the common cold. If there was a drug out there that would cure the common cold, I think we'd know about it by now. I think drug companies have been working on that idea for a long time. So basically, you just have to stay healthy. You have to try to stay away from other people and try to minimize the peak of the incidence of these cases and deaths so it doesn't overwhelm our healthcare system. That's honestly the goal. It's likely to keep coming back every few months in little waves and pockets, and we'll have to keep doing little isolated kind of quarantines as this goes, because it's most likely going to infect the same number of people in total as time goes by. Whether they all get infected in a month's time and just overwhelm our healthcare system, or that number of people get infected over a 2 or 3 year time frame and we can handle the load, is the difference. That's the difference. But don't believe some of the nonsense on the internet that there's going to be some treatment right around the corner for this virus. There's not likely to be that at all. So that's somewhat depressing, but it is what it is. And honesty is important, and not filling people's heads with nonsense is extremely important as well. There have been people who have died because they found chloroquine phosphate, which is a fish tank cleaner, and the words are similar enough to hydroxychloroquine that they thought that was the right thing to take, and so they swallow some of that and they died. So just don't do that. The stuff that I just explained to you is available on the internet if you know how to read it and you understand some of the science behind it. I happen to be a medical doctor who has a biology degree to begin with, so this stuff makes sense to me, more so than other people, granted. I've been a medical practitioner for over 15 years in practice after residency, so I was in my intern year when SARS outbreak occurred. So I have understanding of this, but I tried to impart a little bit of it to you today to arm yourself against the nonsense and stupidity that's out there on the internet. Hopefully for at least a week, till some other stupid thing appears on the internet. Thanks.